Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hi, I'm Rory, and with me, as always, is Ken. How are you today, Ken?
I'm well, thank you for asking, Rory. I'm delighted to be here, and both Rory and myself are delighted that you are joining us for episode 185 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. 3 topics we're going to be delving in today, starting off with a student check-in, where we look at something that a student might come across in their study journey. But I think today is going to be appealing to all, because we're celebrating the women who changed counselling. We're then going to dip our toe into the digital counselling revolution, where we acknowledge that technology is now part of how counselling is delivered and, of course, consumed by our clients. And today we're going to be thinking about choosing the digital tools that we might use if we're working online. And then we end episode 185 with practice matters, where we have a look at something that we might come across in our day-to-day practice as a counsellor. And Rory had a chat with Bernie Wright, who spoke about working with eating disorders, specifically with a focus on competences. So a great episode, 185, starting off with that celebration, I guess, Rory, of the women who changed counselling. And before we go into that, I think it's just worth acknowledging that if you look across the theory of counselling, and when you're studying, it seems to me to be pretty male-dominated, Rory.
It does. And a few years ago, I received an email from someone who talked about the injustice of the fact that there was no, female influence on counselling, both here and in the United States, and I guess across the world, isn't really acknowledged in training. All the theorists are men, and it's one of those emails that I kept going back to. And you read something and you think, I must do something on this. So I got to doing some research, and as people may know, I'm an avid admirer of Carl Rogers, and I've studied him greatly. One of the things that I used to teach my students was the fact that Rogers actually got his ideas from Jessie Taft, who was a female social worker when he worked at the Rochester Child Institute. And get this, Ken, Jessie Taft translated Otto Rank's work from German into English. And Otto Rank, who was a student of Freud, got into a lot of trouble for Freud for changing his mind. That's probably another podcast. I can tell you that. But Otto Rank talked about here and now therapy, which formed the basis of Jessie Taft's work as a social worker at the Rochester Children's Home, where Rogers was a director. He got the job after he graduated from Columbia University with his PhD. And it was Jessie Taft who translated that. It was Jessie Taft who introduced Rogers to what we call Rankian ideas. And it was a woman who Carl Rogers was working with their son, who said to the woman, because he was working in a diagnostic way, and he said that the mother's early rejection of the child had caused the child's issues, and the woman argued the point and said, I don't believe your diagnosis is correct, Dr. Rogers. And in that short sphere of time, Rogers shifted his ideas. He invited Otto Rank over to give a lecture. And as we moved through the middle 1950s, person-centered therapy was born. But it was Jessie Taft, the social worker, who went on to form the basis of social work practice. She had a PhD. She pioneered gay women adopting children. She was a gay woman herself, and lived openly as a gay woman. And it's never taught. And if I were to make a heartfelt plea to those colleagues of mine who teach, let's put some context into how these theorists came to be. Yeah. Another example is Fritz Perls in Gestalt, possibly best known for his work with Gloria, where he was, to be kind, rude, some people may say obnoxious and bullying. But it was his wife, Laura Pills, who was a Gestalt psychologist, who noticed the way their children ate things and ingested food when they moved from Germany to South Africa. When the Nazis came, they were from the Jewish tradition, so that obviously it was a terrible time, and they moved to South Africa. And it was Laura Pills, who was a Gestalt psychologist. And let's put this into perspective: she was a Gestalt psychologist in the 1920s. How hard would it have been for women to get into university? And to put it into more perspective, women in the UK or in England didn't get the full vote until 1928.
Yeah.
And she developed it. And if you read the background, it was quite clearly that it was her idea. And the list is absolutely long. I sat compiling this, and I've got a list of names that just never seem to get talked about. Patricia Clarkson, absolutely brilliant person who gave us intersubjectivity, a whole theory. And of course, Clarkson I think she's held up in the, in the pantheon of theorists who've actually altered counselling. I think she's or psychotherapy. She's one of those people who is recognised as a theorist in her own right. Melanie Klein, who did so much work with children, and Margaret Mailer, Fragile Process, who is another aspect of person-centered counselling. Sorry, that's Margaret Warner. Apologies. Margaret Mailer, who gave us a separation individualization for children, and gave us a psychodynamic route of how children separate from their parents. And if you want a contemporary woman in counselling and psychotherapy, someone whose name you'll probably never heard of, Francine Shapiro. She was the person who invented EDMR, eye desensitized movements and reprogramming therapy, which is now the primary therapy used for post-traumatic stress disorder. And of course, Anna Freud, who developed the theory of fantasy life in children from infanthood. So many female names, and I think the reason that they're not acknowledged is because they're not taught that way. I'm sure there'll be colleagues, and please no letters in the mailbag here, please. I'm sure there'll be colleagues who acknowledge women in therapy. But I think in terms of Roger's work, and I've shifted dramatically on this over the years, I think Jessie Taft should stand absolutely right by his side.
Yeah.
I think if you're teaching, you should acknowledge Jessie Taft, because without her, he would have never met Otto Rank, and he would have gone on to be probably a footnote in history as someone who was a psychoanalytic therapist.
Yeah, and as you're mentioning this, Rory, I'm kind of thinking you don't know what you don't know, and what you do know is what you're taught. And I think that as you've quite rightly done there, you've made that call out to our colleagues that are tutoring, and sure, as you've mentioned, many will be of course acknowledging the women that played such an important part in what we practice today. And I guess it was a sign of the times back in the day, back in what I refer to the black and white days, where it was like a black and white film, because it was a long time ago, that it was a very male-dominated world. The books, the theories, the teaching seemed to be passed along as male, and things have changed. Things have changed dramatically. And it's about looking back and making those acknowledgements. I'm very grateful that I was taught by you, Rory. So what you're speaking about now was part of my training. I mean, we have Counselling Tutor, where you can find more information on what you've spoken about, Rory. And of course, we have our paid-for resources called the Counselling Study Resource. If you're interested in that, counsellingtutor.com, you can get the info. Where again, if you're looking at any kind of histories, you're going to see the influential women that were kind of part of that, because it's built by yourself, Rory, and you've kind of looked into this, and it's an area of interest. And what is interesting to me is we only weeks ago, as we make this podcast, celebrated International Women's Day. And we acknowledge that the world is changing. And but at the same time, when you look around, I feel, and I know voices are shouting this from the rooftop, that it is still very much a male-dominated world. It is that change needs to come. These discussions need to be had. The voices need to be louder. And it's things when I look back in my boyhood, and you looked to who the top chefs were as a boy, and we're talking back in the 1960s, 1970s, it tended to be male chefs. And today, when you look to cooking programs, it tends to still have kind of a bit of a male kind of flavor to that. And I wonder if you look to the literature today that we read when we're doing counselling studies, when you look at that book, is it written by a man or a female? Because if you look at an ethical body and you look at the membership, it is most certainly female dominated at the front line, Rory. So it's counsellors are majority female. It's just an interesting conversation that I think we still got some work on this.
Yes, and when we use female, we do acknowledge the gender diversity of there. But the point we're getting across is the voice of the women. And there's one woman I'd like to finish on. One woman who I think is an unsung hero, an unsung person in the world of counselling. Gloria Zymanski, who was, of course, the star of the 1962 film 3 Approaches to Psychotherapy, shown to students all over, the Gloria film, as it was called. And I feel personally uncomfortable with Gloria. In fact, I actually stopped showing it to the latter age of teaching, because I believe Gloria was exploited. She was told that video was going to be for academics. It ended up in cinemas across the country. She was exploited, in my opinion, by her therapist, because the therapist who sanctioned the film was actually married to her therapist and was seeing her daughter. I mean, good grief. And I think that the way she was treated was very poorly. And I'm going to say, it saddens me greatly, I think Carl Rogers didn't come out of it very well, because if anybody who watches it will notice, he didn't manage the transference very well. And a year later, when Gloria went to a large conference, Gloria asked Rogers if her and his wife Helen Elliott would be their kind of spiritual parents, and he agreed. And I always wondered, if you look at it through a contemporary lens, would that be acceptable now? And I suspect that questions would be asked. But what happened in the past is in the past. But I think we need to really think about the contribution Gloria Zymanski made, because she was exploited without a doubt, but she left a great legacy.
Thank you for popping this topic on today's episode, Rory. I'm very grateful of it, and it's just, again, voices need to be heard. We need to be having these discussions. We at Counselling Tutor have never and will never profess to be experts in anything. All we are two colleagues having a chat. Have a chat with your colleagues on your course or your qualified colleagues. Important discussions to be had. So that is our student check-in for today. Moving on to the digital counselling revolution, where we're going to be discussing choosing the tools that you use when working online, the digital tools that are available to you, and what we need to keep in mind.
Digital Counselling Revolution.
Yes, I think it's an interesting thing that the online world has asked us to have a little box of digital tools. Working online, by definition, means we have to have some kind of digital interface, be that a phone, a video link, even email. And when we choose to use those mediums to speak with our clients, or to see our clients in the case of video, we have to be thoughtful. Are those tools appropriate to use, and are they secure? And I think that when we come to choose our digital toolbox, and I'll use the term toolbox, we need to be very, very thoughtful. We get a lot of inquiries about the security of video platforms and which video platform to use, as well as email, secure email systems. We don't get that many inquiries about security on the phone, and I think the reason for that is you have very little choice. You buy a phone and you use it. However, what I would say is if you use your phone across the internet, because you can have what's called voice over IP, in other words, instead of going through the air, traveling through the air to a radio mast, you can connect your phone to the internet. So you need to be very thoughtful how you connect. And I think it's really important that when you choose your tools, you do some due diligence and make sure that they're appropriate tools and they're secure. So it's for that reason I wouldn't use, say, WhatsApp or FaceTime.
Yeah.
Because I think, I'm not an expert in these matters, but I think that they're owned by social media companies, and there are questions around how that data is handled and what else that data is used for. So I think, Ken, very important that we're very kind of discerning in the digital tools we use in the service of our client.
100%. And one of the questions we get asked quite a lot in our group that is linked to our online and telephone counselling course is what tool should I use for email? What tool should I use for video? What tool should I use for sending invoices? What tool should I use for digital signing of contracts? And the correct answer is, drum roll, the one that you have researched and looked into and satisfied yourself that it is the right fit for you, for your practice, and in service of your clients. This is really such an important area, as you've said, Rory. You were speaking about VoIP just a few moments ago. I think, first of all, understanding the difference between making a telephone call that gets carried down, how can I say, the old phone lines, or a web-based telephone call, and what the differences are in terms of an agreement that is in place. So you mentioned WhatsApp, and again, we don't profess to be experts or know all the details, but there's a lot of buzz on social media from non-counsellors suggesting that they're deleting WhatsApp in their droves because of the how the data is used. When you're signing up, there is pages and pages and pages and pages of terms and conditions that are very seldom read by anybody. I know I'm guilty of that myself, Rory. I download an app. I haven't got 3 hours to pour through a legal document with a magnifying glass, which I wouldn't understand anyway. So I'm pushing agree. And what are you agreeing to there? And when you're making an agreement for a web-based application or a piece of software, keep in mind you're making that agreement potentially for your client as well. If you're going to be using that tool to interact with them, you're making that agreement. So when it comes to the tools that we do use in service of our client, our digital toolbox, I love how you've said that, Rory, our digital toolbox, it's with those tools that we do have to take that time, that we do have to read through what the terms and conditions are, what the license agreement is. And there's another side to this as well. So if you are based in the European Union or the United Kingdom, then you would be aware of General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR as the acronym. Well, if you are working within those areas, whenever you are using a application where data is being collected, you have to have a written contract in place with the provider of that service. So, for example, and I'm just using this as an example, we don't kind of stamp any piece of software and say use that, but Zoom is very popular and it's used by many for doing video counseling. So Zoom, if you go to Zoom, there is something called a data processing agreement. And a data processing agreement is an agreement between Zoom and yourself that you sign and you date, and you both have a copy that indicates how the data is used and transferred. And I went and had a look at the Zoom data processing agreement. It's updated regularly, and it's 27 pages long. It's a 27-page long contract that you read through. It explains how data is collected, how it is used, how it is stored, and then you put in your company name or your organization name, and you're going to be putting your signature on that, and that becomes part of your GDPR compliance. You need to have that on file, and that is the same for any application, software, or external provider that you may be using where data is being stored or shared across that tool. So I think that's really important. When choosing your tools, have a look for the DPA, or the Data Processing Agreement. Usually you can find it. So if you went into Google and you put in the word Zoom and then after it put Data Processing Agreement, or even just DPA, you'll find it. It'll be listed there. And for a lot of software, that is the case. If you're unable to find a DPA, and details are being collected, maybe then that tool wouldn't be a good fit for you, because you would be stepping outside of GDPR. And GDPR on their website, so that is the ico.org.uk, whenever a controller uses a processor to process personal data on their behalf, a written contract needs to be in place between the parties. It's not a choice. It's not a nice to have. It is legislation. And if something went wrong and it was not in place, well, there would be consequences. It's legislation. We don't get to choose whether we follow that or not. So I think it's something that needs to be considered. It's in the same way as you would consider where your counselling room was and what the confidentiality of that counselling room might be, and could anybody see in the window, and how you might lay out that counselling room, and how you might not put in personal items in that counselling room. The same consideration, the same time, the same attention to detail to the digital toolbox that you choose for working with your clients.
Absolutely, Ken. Couldn't agree more. And also I'd say that there's a proliferation of free digital tools on the internet. And it might be very tempting to say, well, you know, as a private practitioner, I'm always looking at the costs in my work. And if I can get something for free, that means it's free. If someone offers me for free, I always have a look at what am I actually paying for. And usually you find that something that's free, certainly on the internet, you pay for in a different way. That could be advertising pop-ups, or it could be in some cases the fact that you don't get a higher level of security. So I think when you're choosing digital tools, what you need to do is think about it, as Ken said, in terms of your room. You hire a room, it costs you a fee. You may very well have to use the same mentality of paying a fee when you work online, and have a look what the difference between a free digital tool is and their paid options. And when you come to have a look at it, have a look in terms of the security and what else you get. And you'd be surprised, just paying a smaller fee can get you a whole lot more. The reason companies give you things for free, I guess, is because they want you as a customer, so they can they can keep in contact with you. So be very thoughtful and do, as Ken said, due diligence. Make sure that what you're using is fit for purpose and ultimately secure.
It can be daunting choosing your digital toolbox. It can also be really exciting and a great challenge to choose your digital toolbox. And we wish you well in whatever application or piece of software you choose to kind of invest your time in service of your clients to use within your practice. Of course, we run a course. It's an online and telephone counselling certificate course, and we cover this topic in great detail within the course for very obvious reasons. It's back again to that you don't know what you don't know. We're required to do CPD, continuing professional development, to educate us, to keep up to date with what is needed within our practice. And if we're working online, that is changing all the time. We need to keep up to date with what is happening. If you're interested in the Counselling Tutor online and telephone counselling certificate course. CounsellingTutor.com, that's the place to go, all the information there. Leaving the digital counselling revolution behind us and working our way through to Practice Matters, where we look at something that we might come across in practice. And Rory, we've got an exciting one because you met with Bernie Wright, who delivered a lecture for our counsellor CPD library, and you spoke about working with eating disorders.
Absolutely. I caught up with Bernie Wright, who is an expert and a pioneer in working with eating disorders. And we spoke about the competencies you need to be a really effective therapist when working with someone who's presenting with an eating disorder. And this is what she had to say.
Practice Matters.
And we welcome Bernie Wright, who has recently delivered a fantastic lecture on working with eating disorders for our counsellor CPD library. Bernie, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you, Rory. I really valued coming on the other night to do the talk, and my hope for doing it is literally just that we can get more people less afraid and less scared, and we'll work within this field.
Well, yeah, absolutely, and it is a growing field from what I can gather. Disordered eating is something that is quite prevalent in our society at the moment.
Huge, absolutely. And since the pandemic, since the virus, we've had so many problems with people just really escalating into using food, either by restricting or by overeating, both to self-medicate and sedate themselves.
Yeah, so the lockdown has kind of intensified disordered eating, would you say?
Oh, absolutely. And parents who thought their children were eating found out their children were living on air, or that they were purging and vomiting, or that they were overeating. So it's been a real shock for parents. So people like me, or we've always inundated, to be honest, Rory, but recently we have just had referrals we just literally cannot cope with.
Oh, good grief. And of course, with referrals means that there's more demand. And of course, training counsellors in this area is absolutely essential to meet the demand of the unmet need.
Absolutely, because we have the NHS waiting list that's absolutely, overstretched and underfunded, and people just don't know enough about eating disorders. And I think that we have to go through from every, in my professional opinion, every mental health professional has to get training in this field. It is totally imperative.
Yeah.
If the GPs don't know and don't understand the complexity, which often happens, it can make it worse. It can make it harder to treat.
What kind of confusion may GPs have over eating disorders? Why would GPs not know enough?
I think they have 2 hours in medical school. But the thing about, as I was saying the other night, Laura, because eating disorders is so persuasive, there's aversive, and a lot of my clients are told just go away and eat, and they may say get them to watch the programme on anorexia nervosa tonight. And of course, anorexia nervosa, as I was explaining the other night, is so competitive that you just wouldn't. That is just not advice. It's more, and doctors need to know how to speak to the voice, how to speak to the third person in the room, which is the voice of anorexia nervosa.
Yes, just speak about that, because that's one of the things that I felt was really interesting. You spoke about it. Lots of people commented on the voice. What is the voice?
It's a third person room. It's a very critical, almost a dictatorial. You're fat, you're ugly. And at some stage it can seem so loud. And Laura Hill does an amazing YouTube on called Inside Out that I really recommend people listen to, because it really can support knowledge in this field.
Yes.
The other night, we have 3 people. We have the voice, myself, and the client.
And when we're talking about the voice, this is a voice within the client, a configuration of the client.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes. I mean, I think one of the things I took away from the lecture was that it's not something that a therapist can work with without an in-depth understanding or training. It's not a presentation to be worked with in the hope that your core counselling qualification will be enough. You definitely need extra training in this area, don't you?
It should be absolutely essential. I have got no idea why training institutions are not getting people in to do modules. I was really delighted recently when the Link Centre in Crowborough actually brought me in to do a whole day's training with their students, and at least they're safer leaving college than they were before.
Absolutely, and of course, disordered eating can be a secondary presentation. People may come in with another presentation. In my experience, they may present with anxiety or depression or another kind of presentation, and it emerges during the arc of therapy that actually it's disordered eating that's the heart of the issue.
Absolutely, because if we're not feeding the body, the mind, and the soul, then nothing changes. So the problem, I think, what we've done so far within the therapeutic world, Rory, is not, we have to work with the physiology and the psychology, otherwise nothing changes. Then the relationship is vital, but unless we deal with dietary chaos right from the onset, we have very little success, in my professional opinion.
Yes, and the other thing that really struck me is that this can be a multidisciplinary environment. It could be that there's lots of people involved in supporting the client. Could be the doctor, could be a dietitian, depending on where the client is and what their disordered eating pattern looks like.
Absolutely. So that's a really good point. So if someone comes in with an eating disorder, or I get an assessment, it comes out, because we need to actually ask, each client, what is your relationship like with food, weight, and shape? 0 that you don't think about food, weight, and shape at all. 10, that is all you think about. Where would you be on that scale? And they might say 10, and then of course it doesn't matter what they want to call it. You then know you've got to work with, so I will work with a dietitian, a nutritionist, a psychiatrist if pharmacology is needed, a GP. It's multiple. You cannot work with this issue on your own.
Yes, and I think when we look at counselling directories, I know when I went onto a counselling directory, we had a tick box that he ticked the things you could work with, and I didn't tick eating disorders because I knew I wasn't trained in eating disorders, and it would be unfair for me to see a client with disordered eating because I won't be able to offer that service. But I think I look in counselling directories and I see sometimes a lot of people have put that in their portfolio of offer to clients, and I do wonder if people are trained. Having heard your lecture, it seems to me that 3 hours of CPD or reading a book about it isn't absolutely not enough.
Absolutely, Rory. And I always something on my Twitter feed when I'm feeling irritated, I will put all the therapists out there, please untick the boxes to say that you work with eating disorders and people in larger bodies, unless you genuinely have. And I don't mean just a short course. I mean the 2-day course that I do, it does allow you to work ethically and competently. And I'm sure that the people who listened to my talk the other night may be more aware, which is what I set out to do, passionately. But if you're really going to work, then you need to do some really proper training. And the National Centre for Eating Disorders does an amazing schedule.
Yes, and I think it's becoming clear, not just in the areas of disordered eating, but in other areas that generic counselling skills are just not enough. This isn't working with the worried well, as we'd say in training. This is working with people who have got real difficulties in a specific area.
Exactly, and of course the problem we have is that a lot of these clients, if the mother, the father, or the husband or the wife, or the partner, or whoever, is saying you need to get therapy, you're too thin, you're in too much of a large, whatever people are told, and of course they then will go into therapy and sit quite happily with a therapist for 1 to 2 years, which happens so much I cannot tell you, and nothing changes, but it does keep the parents off their back.
Yes.
They're saying, well, I'm getting therapy. By the time they get to me, it's so ingrained. And we're actually just getting someone into hospital Monday that was working with a lovely therapist, but way outside of competence.
Yes.
So the time that the therapist came to me for supervision, it was like, this child has to be in hospital.
Absolutely, and I think you make a really, really interesting point, because the client could spend a lot of time in therapy and not actually get any value out of it, because the therapist isn't equipped to deal with the issues.
No, because the client comes in and just talks about, you know, what happened with the mother, the father, the dog, or the cat. It's like, hey ho, we need to actually look at the physiology, we need to look at the psychology, we need to see what they're eating, we need to get the nutritionist on board. Because, you know, therapy will not work with someone who is of that vein unless they're actually working, you know, with both a nutritionist and a therapist.
So as we come to this interview, Bernie, if you had one observation to share with our audience about working with eating disorders, one thing that people could take away and maybe reflect on, what would that be?
Don't be afraid. If you're a trained therapist, every single one of you can work in this field. And I don't know, I've always had this thought, and I've got no best whether I'm right or wrong, but it seems to be, it's getting better. But it seems to be we've done almost what Freud did with sexual abuse. It's almost we can't look at it. And perhaps it's because we don't look at our own relationship with food ourselves. It's too painful to go to. I don't know. I'll be interested in what counselling tutors, people who listen today actually do think.
Well, there we go. So on that final note of physician, heal thyself, Bernie Wright, thank you very much for joining us.
Big thank you to Bernie Wright, and a big thank you as always to you, Rory, for taking your time. You know, I just want to stop for a moment, pause, and really shine this light on you, Rory, of thanks, because you take the time to prepare for these podcasts. You put all the different sections together. So much preparation goes in. You took your time to meet up with Bernie and all of our other guests. So I just want to say thank you on behalf of all of our listeners for what you do.
Well, thank you very much. And what an episode this has been.
Moving quickly along there.
I feel a little bit wobbly now. Moving quickly along. So, yes, student check-in. We started with student check-in and the women who changed counselling, a warm and appreciative outline of our female colleagues through history who have made the profession what it is. And we thank those people who are making the profession what it is today. It's still ongoing. In the digital counselling revolution, we talked about choosing your digital tools and thinking about what tools you're going to put in your toolbox and how secure they are. And then finally, we caught up with Bernie Wright, who is an expert in eating disorders, and she outlined beautifully the competencies you need to work with what can be a very challenging presentation. And as always, stay grounded, stay safe, and join the digital counselling revolution. I've gone all red now. I think I'm blushing.
If you're a qualified counsellor or psychotherapist, then why not check out the Counsellor CPD Library? Stay current with your CPD requirements with over 150 hours of academically rigorous, on-demand lectures you can stream to your device. Joining Counselor CPD will expand your skill set to create a more specialised, highly rewarding practice. For more information on the Counselor CPD Library, visit counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.